and I'll keep my pen.
To welcome you all, and I'm Shomokra Chaudhary, and very nice to see everybody. I hope people are still trickling in. I want to set the context of this by saying, this is the second Inspire lecture that's being organized at Ashoka. Of course, if you have read the little leaflet that's next to you, and you hadn't attended the first one, you would know that it was set up in June 2021 when the first Inspire lecture was organized. And there, the intention of these lectures was set out by Professor Malavika Sharkar, who wrote this down, and I'm going to quote from her. She didn't want to say it herself, asked me to do it. And the blurb reads as follows. It says that interdisciplinarity, the belief that knowledge has no boundaries, has been a foundational premise in the growth of human knowledge. Once this was known and understood. For example, in De Revolutionibus, Copernicus had described astronomy and mathematics at the head of all the liberal arts. With the fracturing of disciplines into specialized fields and subfields, it was imperative to remind ourselves of the foundational value of interdisciplinarity and the importance of trespassing academic boundaries. The Ashoka University Inspire lectures on the theme of interdisciplinarity have been planned as a series of annual invited talks by distinguished speakers. And the first one was held in June 2021, and by, of course, Professor Dame Gillian Beer, the King Edward VII Professor Emeritus at the University of Cambridge, President of Clare Hall, who gave her talk on Darwin and the Descent of Woman. But that was online. So here you are. The second one is the first one in person. This makes it a very special occasion. And we have a very, very distinguished speaker today. And to welcome her and to introduce her, I would call our Chancellor, Professor Rudhanshu Mukherjee, to come on stage.
I'm delighted to welcome Professor Ruth Harris to Ashoka University and to deliver the second Inspire lectures. We couldn't think of a more distinguished person to deliver this lecture. Professor Ruth Harris has won the Wolfson Prize in 2010, Wolfson Prize for History, for her book or her biography of Dreyfus. She has been a fellow of New College, Oxford. She delivered the Trevelyan Lectures at the University of Cambridge in 2017. She's a senior research fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, and has the title of distinction of being the professor of modern history in the University of Oxford. But what this simple dry as dust biodata conceals is that when she was shortlisted for a position in that male bastion of Oxford, Christchurch, she actually withdrew her application because she discovered there was only one woman fellow of that college, and she didn't want to be a part of that kind of tokenism. There is also another thing that is unique, and as a student of history, I recognize this, that most professors of European history do not write on India. They remain confined to their own specializations. They not only, in my experience, they not only not write on India, they even don't read on India. And here we have a professor of modern history who has written a book and has carried out research on the life and work of Narendra Datta, who is more famously known as Swami Vivekananda. This is something to welcome, and I hope that Ruth Harris has set an example, has opened up a new vista for scholars of European history, of European culture, that they would work more on India. So also, you just heard the Inspire lectures say that knowledge has no boundaries. And quoting from Copernicus, as Shomok just did, Vivekananda becoming a guru in the US just exemplifies this point that knowledge has no national boundaries. And Ashoka University also believes that knowledge has no national boundaries. So with these words, I would welcome Professor Ruth Harris. Ruth, yours to take away.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I can't tell you what a pleasure, but mostly what an honor it is to be in India. You'll see that there's a slight difference between the advertised talk and my PowerPoint. Don't let it confuse you. This is slightly more specialist, and I thought I would give you a general view of my book, which is called Guru to the World, Vivekananda's Life and Legacy. And the reason why it's such an honor to be here is that when I'm asked to give talks on Vivekananda in Europe or the United States, I generally have to start off by saying who he was and then go on to talk about why he was important. I think I can take it for granted that such an introduction is not necessary here. But the underlying question remains. The argument in my book is that Vivekananda must and should be seen as one of the seminal figures of the global 19th century. But the pattern of his fame does not in any way match that of his influence. Here he's a household name. In the West, very few have even heard of him. Why this is the case goes to the heart of his life, his ideas, and his program. Now today, what I want to begin to look at and to ask some unaccustomed questions is why this was the case, and to delve into why his words challenged and enticed so many different kinds of audiences around the world. Why did publics as diverse as respectable New Englanders, and I'll show you some pictures of them later, and Swadeshi terrorists, I put that in inverted commas, honor him so fervently? I hope also that you'll understand that the rubric Guru to the World was not designed to reinforce the tired story of Vivekananda as the first global guru who unlocked Eastern spirituality for the materialist West. Although I chose the title deliberately, I want to query this view rather than reinforce it. I too want to talk about Vivekananda's relationship to Hinduism, nationalism, anti-colonialism, and karma yoga. But I also want to depart from the constraining vision of him as a Hindu revivalist. Instead, I want to combine the Indian Vivekananda with the global guru that Westerners, and many Indians as well, came to venerate as the epitome of Indian spirituality, quote, tolerance, and universalism. I insist in my book that there is only one man, a figure endlessly responding to circumstance and milieu, and like so many of the great Indian thinkers of the 20th century, who were also politicians as well as spiritual figures, they were doing what they did on the hoof, constantly lecturing, constantly talking. Vivekananda was lucky until 1898, at least to have a stenographer for many of his most famous talks. I'm not going to talk about Vivekananda's importance to present-day India because I'm not an Indian and I'm not qualified to do so. But I hope to bring to life the late 19th century world that he inhabited. And it takes a little bit of an attempt at imaginative reconstruction. It's very hard for us now to recapture the currents of fin-de-siècle globalism when Boston ladies in their drawing rooms read Muller's Sacred Books of the East, and English-educated Calcuttans read Emerson, and eminent scientists, even the most eminent scientists, took spiritualism seriously. Science, religion, and the occult swirled in eddies that flowed into one another, and the conversations they provoked were all the more interesting and sometimes trenchant precisely because of surging anti-colonialism. And it's into this whirlpool that Vivekananda enters. Above all, Vivekananda and his audiences everywhere often saw India and discussed India through the Orientalist distinction between Eastern spirituality and Western materialism. I think that many of you won't even know this distinction, but this is the way people spoke about India in the 19th century. Such views meant that Vivekananda had to fight against cliches, stereotypes, and prejudices. And at the same time, and this is what's paradoxical, it was these very oppositions that permitted his entry into American and British circles as he deployed them, these very stereotypes, to insist on India's unique importance for global culture. And it's this paradox, this tension, that I hope to explore. I want to show how Vivekananda asserted the value of different unities that were almost as various as the diversity that he treasured as central to Indian identity. And many of the lessons that he gave in America were really harsh lessons. I do not want to suggest that Vivekananda came up with a seamless philosophy or system. Far from it. Instead, he wanted to argue different forms of universalism that challenge Western hegemony and to make people, both in India and in the West, to think outside the box. In the 1890s, he was the first to articulate a powerful critique of the exclusivism of Christianity as the single religion of redemption on Christian soil. And this to an audience that normally was already in the process of seeing science as the new God. Instead, he also rejected the claims that science would replace spirituality. Let's take, for example, the famous appearance at the World Parliament of Religion in Chicago in 1893, which of course is the cliche, the legend that has a lot of truth in it. There he is, you all know him, you've all seen him this way. He takes the podium. In every way, he rejects the stereotypes of both Indians and Westerners by not looking like anybody they've ever seen. The scarlet tunic and orange turban meant he resembled neither the wandering sadhu of Orientalist imaginings, nor the Western Christian minister in somber black with white collar. The turban comes from the Raja of Khetri, and the costume, the scarlet suit, that actually is created with the help of the New England ladies that he meets before the Parliament. Rather than being grateful for being allowed to speak at all, he addresses his audience as, quote, sisters and brothers, not as masters. And he does not see Jesus as the only path to salvation, although he readily accepts Christ as an avatara. He proclaims instead, quote, we believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions to be true. Words, bearing, and character all rejected what he regarded as Western, quote, fanaticism and the hegemony it claimed. Now, what people don't ask in the hagiographies is why his remarks were greeted with such wild applause. It's the other side, in a sense, that's interesting. Somehow, he tapped into a vein of self-criticism, doubt, and vulnerability within his Western hearers. Witnesses remembered the thrill they experienced when he said that it was, quote, a sin to call them men sinners, and then attacked Christian notions of original sin and hellfire. His words fell on fertile soil as he spoke to Americans' growing rejection of an all-powerful and punitive God and reconsidered their relationship to biblical creationism. Vivekananda's words, however, did not shift the views of Orthodox Christians. For them, Indians remained heathens, worshiping idols, and he reacted badly when more than once women asked him if Indian mothers threw their babies to crocodiles. And it's a very interesting thing. In many different cities, people asked him this question. So it was something that was actually rather widespread. If they were not heathens, then Indians were metaphysicians, somehow like Jesuits. And I can't insist enough, the anti-clerical Protestant vision of Catholics as true heathens in America. So when they say he's like a Jesuit, they see him as somebody taken up with a transcendental search that was nihilistic. More than once, Vivekananda was described as Jesuitical to suggest a sophistry that underpinned his superficial brilliance. Even the remarkable philosopher and psychologist William James, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902, said that Hinduism was ultimately nothing more than, quote, a sumptuosity of security. Now, we all know about Vivekananda's relationship with Max Muller, but the connection to James is remarkable, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But what's important here is that Vivekananda, who had engaged with James on other occasions, resisted this Orientalist cliche about characterless Indians and their incapacity to deal with real-world problems. Such remarks explain why he insisted, especially there, on practical Vedanta. At worst, and this is very interesting, his new audience wanted a yogi who could perform magical tricks, not dissimilar to the Indian snake charmers or the rope climbers who drew crowds to American vaudeville theaters. Such remarks suggest why Raja Yoga concentrated on mental states rather than, quote, on getting powers, and teased Americans for their own fascination with the occult. And the reason why I stress that is many people like to see Vivekananda as the first New Age guru. That is not what he was, or else he would have spoken in a different way. In deploying his persona as much as his words and deeds in this battle, he did it provocatively, above all by arguing against the separation between religion and science. His contribution in this domain is rarely considered, despite its importance and novelty. He not only rejected Christian exclusivism, but also the universalist claims of the European Enlightenment. He welcomed scientific discoveries and played always with the metaphors of science, especially evolution, thermodynamics, and germ theory. But he believed that they would only confirm the spiritual and cosmological truths he already held dear. Vivekananda promoted science and technology, but always saw them as handmaidens to Vedanta. And he wrote, "It seems to us that the conclusions of modern science are the very conclusions that Vedanta reached ages ago, but in modern science, they are written in the language of matter." So he was not unhappy that they should be written in the language of matter, and he cultivated this. But he wanted people to recognize that there were different levels of understanding. Moreover, he asserted that processes of creation and destruction outlined in evolution were already present in laws of karma. He believed in evolution, but not in the competition of natural selection, especially not for the higher reaches of human development. And if you think, oh, that's because he was behind the times, he didn't understand natural selection, he was hardly the only one in the fin-de-siècle to do so. Many notable scientists, above all his co-discoverer of evolutionary theory, Alfred Russel Wallace, also refused the idea that natural selection operated in the domains of thought and morality. And remember that the full synthesis of Darwinism was only truly completed in the interwar period in the 20th century. In rejecting what we now consider to be reductive forms of social Darwinism, Vivekananda also rejected colonialism and realized that both Western science and Christianity could be used to beat Indians for failing to measure up to European standards. He rejected the survival of the fittest as, quote, furnishing every oppressor with an argument to calm the qualms of conscience. This, of course, was part also of his critique of British imperialism and muscular Christianity. Instead, he turned to Patanjali, who he believed explained that, quote, the true secret of evolution is the manifestation of perfection, which is already in every being. These kinds of statements were the ones that most appealed to his Western followers, who saw the idea of the essential self or the authentic self as in tune with their own transcendental ideas. Remember, New Englanders in particular had some sort of vision of what Indian thought was like through Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Thoreau. In London, he once said, quote, if a man quotes a Moses or a Buddha or a Christ, he is laughed at, but let them give the name of Huxley or Darwin, and it is swallowed with salt. By the way, he read Darwin and he read Huxley, so he knew what he was saying. With an insight rare for the period, he saw that scientific debate, as much as religious controversy, could be pervaded by metaphor, bias, and unacknowledged prejudice, and that both could become little more than superstition. Science was a part of his synthesis, but it was not an end in itself. He furthered this belief when he pressed Sister Nivedita to work with J.C. Bose to create what they called together Vedantic science, and what she called national science. Above all, however, he focused on experience, the notion that served as a bridge between him and his Western audience. As idealists who had rejected both conventional Christianity and a reductive positivism, they were enthralled by the so-called new sciences of mind that were emerging in psychology and anthropology, many of these used to justify colonial hierarchies. But they turned to Vivekananda to hear his insights on perception, states of meditation, and what he called super consciousness. The people he dealt with were often in, quote, alternative and avant-garde circles, and we will have more to say about them soon. Like Vivekananda, they participated in what the Cambridge historian Chris Bailey has called the global idealist moment. They listened when Vivekananda argued that modern science reinforced the ancient wisdom of India, concerned with processes of creation and destruction, and when he insisted that Indian spirituality promoted an experimental template for religious and spiritual universalism. Now there they are. Vivekananda is at Greenacre, Maine, with his Yankee followers. I love this picture. How many of you have seen this? A few of you have seen it. The reason why I love it so much, I'm going to step away from the microphone, is always, he's in the center. And he's in the center when they take photographs of him in the World Parliament. And what is so interesting is that he's with the woman who starts Greenacre, Sarah Farmer. But you can see he, if anything, seeks to exaggerate the difference between him and these very proper New England people who are highly educated, but as I will explain, he sees them as dry. Now, naturally, they saw his ideas through their own spiritual lens. Here we see Vivekananda amidst his Yankee acquaintances at Greenacre, Maine, where he observed and studied the Americans' ideas. Of course, he already knew of theosophy, but he was intrigued by Christian Science. And this, again, is very interesting. Christian Science, again, tries to bring together Christianity and science. When she used the word science, Mary Baker Eddy, she was talking about processes of discovery. And what she said was that humanity's suffering was nothing more than, quote, waking dream shadows, a description strikingly like the Maya of Vedanta. And when he first encounters them, he says, they're sort of Vedantans. That's what he says. He listened to spiritualist lectures, learned their views on comparative religion, and watched them perform healings. He was largely unimpressed, but believed that the people were spiritually dry and physically brittle. For this reason, he proceeded to give his first lessons in yoga under the so-called Swami's Pine, which became the basis for Raja Yoga, the first self-help manual in English on the practice of yoga, where he hoped to bring insight and physical suppleness to an inflexible, if virtuous, spiritual world. He came to believe that Indians were right to be proud of their religious cultures. Now, experience was so important to both Vivekananda and his audiences, both abroad and in India, because it denoted a shift away from pure intellect and textual study to forms of understanding that connected individuals to the divine. It was central to the semi-literate Ramakrishna, who had prioritized his mystical experiences over sacred texts. And there's a discussion, even over the Gita with Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, where Vivekananda dares to say it was not written by a divine hand. And after first being shocked, Ramakrishna is willing to think about it. This is really interesting. And in the way William James emphasized it in his groundbreaking Varieties of Religious Experience, a work crucial in the study of comparative religion and psychology. By emphasizing experience, both sides in the discussion underscored their inner worlds, subjective understandings, and embodied awareness. Their view of religious experience necessarily diverged, however, despite the common terrain. And this is what's so interesting. They were willing to talk about experience, but it was much harder to understand the differences in experience. Vivekananda spoke of Advaita, of the paradox of self and non-self, that had a long and venerated metaphysical pedigree in India, but his Western audience had difficulty understanding him. Nonetheless, in both the East and West, Vivekananda, as well as philosophical idealists and pragmatists with whom he sparred, be they Harvard professors or theosophists, argue that the subject was not a free will agent of Cartesian dualism, but one that recognized that experience signified possibilities beyond the world of objects and rational deduction. The intuition may explain why feminine experience was often central to apprehending what was deemed beyond the masculine domain of reason. William James also had recourse to female mediums and experiments, while Vivekananda acknowledged women's spiritual power. And here I have a slide of a very famous medium named Eusapia Palladino. I have to say, she is later uncovered and as a fraud. And William James was very keen that all the frauds should be dispensed with. But it goes to show that this great, quote, scientist and philosopher was also so keen on working with these spiritual mediums as a way of experimenting. Women were vital to everything that Vivekananda did. And the reason why it's so important is we have to absorb and develop a different view of what all in the West everyone calls the feminization of religion. Now, this term conjures up the armies of Christian female missionaries who worked at home and in the colonies. But his enterprise strikingly inverted the normal alliances. What's so extraordinary about these women is that they start off as very serious Christians. Some of them, like Nivedita, are the children, daughters of ministers. And in their manner and way of thinking about the world, you would have thought they should have become missionaries. And instead, they become anti-imperialists. And this is what I found most extraordinary and overturning in terms of the way we normally think about these kinds of women. So they oppose Christian missionaries, and some of their most eloquent statements are against Christian missionaries, and oftentimes even imperialism. And Indian female figures become the new saints of this form of Hindu universalism. I'll say more about Sharada Devi in a little while. By connecting with women both in India and in the West, Vivekananda brought their worlds together. Indeed, the internationalization of his enterprise demanded that he do so. He realized that to succeed, he had to put together the world of Western activists and their alternative spirituality with Hindu wifehood, motherhood, and female sainthood. Such aims, however, also profoundly contradictory. These women, Sharada and these women, were very different. Such aims, however, and later he was troubled that he could not find more reliable men in the West to support his efforts. And that also was very, very tricky for him. At the beginning, he was very happy to have the female acolytes, and famously said, well, it wasn't famous, I'm explaining it, that he was a woman amongst women. This goes very much against the stereotype of the man making Vivekananda. But as time went on, he realized that it was very difficult to get men to support his form of spiritual universalism. But these women were nonetheless crucial to creating worldwide Vedanta and disseminating yoga, and central to promoting a vision of India as the world's spiritual teacher. And yet, the relationship of Vivekananda to this women's world is central both to his developing view of Hinduism and to his vision of India and worldwide Vedanta. The stories are legendary. Here she is. Early on in India, he was reluctant to undertake new ventures without the support of Ramakrishna's widow, Sharada Devi, requiring her permission before leaving for America. He learned about American religion almost exclusively from women and was struck by their moral and intellectual independence, even if later he became more critical of what he condemned as spiritual superficiality. And it's important to note that the women who did go to India were by and large British. They were not the American women. There's one American woman, Sister Christine, but on the whole, it was the British who went. He was welcomed into the unusual world of highly educated Yankee ladies, which included novelists, female lecturers and reformers, women with old Puritan pedigrees, often substantial wealth, and links to Harvard academics and New England theologians. And there we see her, Vivekananda's mother, Sarah Bull, who was the wife of the great violin virtuoso, Ola Bull from Norway. And what's so interesting is she's interested in Vivekananda because Norway is at this point seen as colonized by Sweden. And so he doesn't live to see Sweden let go of Norway until 1905. But again, I want to help you capture in your imagination the strange kinds of alliances and interconnections that are going on in people's minds. Even though they had fantasies about the Dark Orient, for most, Vivekananda was their first encounter with a real South Asian, let alone a Bengali intellectual. Remember that the poor Indians who came to America to work in difficult manual labor only came in the 1890s. So there was very little familiarity with Indians. It is not like the indentured population of Indians in many other parts of the world. And this is an important difference. They were astonished by his beauty, intelligence, and wit, and overwhelmed him with both curiosity and hospitality. His celibacy enabled a rare social intimacy, which also paradoxically reinforced an image of manly restraint, so important to the self-image he was trying to create as a renouncer, and as an attempt to step outside the cliche that was being developed of Hindu men as Svengalis or seducers, the bad guru. Do you see what I mean? So he was a very important and distinctive personality. Although the sexual boundary was observed, at times distressing emotional entanglements resulted on hurt on both sides, and he's very open about this. He keeps on saying, I'm personal in my love, but I must not show it. I have to not do this. Above all, and in deliberate contrast to Christian missionaries, Vivekananda sought no converts and distanced himself from formalized church building while beginning the Vedanta societies. And he famously proclaimed the method, he only wanted to make a Methodist a better Methodist, the Presbyterian a better Presbyterian, the Unitarian a better Unitarian. Now imagine that in America, where the religious and evangelical boiling pot is all about getting new followers and pushing others aside. This was for them an extraordinary statement. He sought instead to exemplify the tolerance that for him was the essence of Hinduism, describing India's welcome of Jews after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem during the Parliament, and the embrace of fleeing Zoroastrians. He therefore presented, quote, spiritual India at the Parliament as the eternal refuge, a portrayal which necessarily set aside growing intercommunal rivalry between Hindus and Muslims, as well as untouchability. He also sidestepped Pandita Ramabai's observations of the Hindu vision of Indian women. All of you know about Pandita Ramabai. Sorry, in America no one's heard of her, so I'm just saying. Afraid that such critiques would yet again diminish Indians. You know, Pandita Ramabai had over 70 societies designed to defend Indian women against against Indian patriarchy. And you can see the tightrope he has to walk, you see? Because of the unequal power between India and the West, he remained always on the defensive. His discourse on, quote, tolerance, a word he didn't really like, was central to his appeal and revealed another dimension of an essentialized Hinduism that was internationalized and important to his national vision. Now, this, I suggest, is the profound paradox of claiming to be a guru to the world or the world's spiritual teacher. You can talk about, you can give your lessons, but it's harder, and for him at least, to talk about the problems of India openly because he couldn't engage with those issues without people saying that India was unworthy. Contrary to the man-making stereotype for which he is today celebrated, he plainly acknowledged in America, as I said, that he was a woman amongst women. As he and the women he associated with created experimental relationships that were both life-enhancing and disruptive. I mean, remember, Vivekananda lived in India in a virtually male world, and the only women he knew were in his family, his mothers and his sisters. So, although his mother and his sisters were very educated women, so I don't think he was surprised by meeting and engaging with educated women. He remarked in 1897 that if I have to come back again as a woman, I must and will come back as an American woman. He could not help but compare their freedoms to the constraints that ruled Indian women, whose condition had been at the center of both reformist and orthodox debate over westernization and so-called indigenism from mid-century. But there was more here than admiration. He acknowledged their spiritual and moral prowess, but he was also ambivalent over their philanthropy and activism, which he feared might be used against his fellow Indians. He remained wary of coercive processes of Western so-called emancipation, especially for Indian women, so he opposed child marriage violently, but he feared widow remarriage and regarded it as a spiritual death. brides, he continued to believe, when he spoke in California in 1900, should take a subordinate role to the son's mother until they become mothers in turn. Vivekananda always presented himself as Ramakrishna's disciple, and at times he held an even more exalted view of Sharada. For Vivekananda, she was central to how he envisaged the maternal in his theology, but she was above all a living spiritual guide. When he returned to India for the first time in 1897, he washed himself in the Ganges before meeting her so as not to contaminate her with foreign corruption. Ordinarily, he derided such rituals as don't-touchism, but with her, he readily cast aside his cloak of so-called enlightenment. He never saw himself in her spiritual league, and I think this is, again, very interesting. Sharada became paramount to his mission because, at least in his eyes, she seemed able to square the circle, to be the ideal Hindu woman while also resisting convention, first by continuing to wear her wedding bangles and red-bordered sari, and later by sharing food with his foreign devotees. And there she is with Sharada Devi. Margaret Noble is with Sharada Devi. And I think it's very interesting because here in this picture, Margaret Noble is not wearing her improvised nun's costume. They're both in white, but they're very much, again, it's about East meeting West, isn't it? Despite the many constraints placed on Brahmin widows, the strength of Sharada's personality emerges. And of course, this is always difficult because, like Ramakrishna, we have no first-hand account of what she felt and said. We only have anecdotes that explain her or talk about her. But there are enough to suggest that she was really quite something. When she was attacked by a mischievous disciple, she apparently slapped him and held his tongue to make him stop. She tried to help sex workers against Ramakrishna's instructions, believing that by using her own judgment, she honored him. And actually, when the Western women went to visit her, they asked her about obedience to the Guru, submission to the Guru. And that's what she told them, that you submit to the Guru by honoring your own judgment. And I think they found that extraordinary because Vivekananda was never as straightforward in how he described the relationship of the Guru to the disciple. After his death, after Ramakrishna's death, she traveled far and wide, counseled the poor and mighty, and cooked endlessly for each disciple, tailoring each dish to the monk's physiological makeup and preferences. Now, of course, we might see this as just another aspect of feminine slavery, but the last service was clearly seen as a metaphor for spiritual progress. Each person needed to find a religious path suitable to his or her spiritual constitution. Sharada Devi was honored for her, quote, practical application of this understanding. But despite all these idealizations, he was also caught short by the very idealizations that he created. Certainly for him, the Holy Mother was the ideal Hindu woman, and yet he required different kinds of workers, and so he sought another ideal and found it in what he called his Celtic lioness, and that is, of course, Sister Nivedita. Oops, that's not the one I wanted. It doesn't matter because I've shown you, there they are together. She later also admitted that, this is Nivedita, that Vivekananda's idealizations had left her feeling sometimes inadequate or misunderstood. And in the end of her days, she took a softer stance than her master in regard to marriage and celibacy. Nevertheless, she prided herself on becoming a Hinduized European who both embodied his synthesis and extended it. She was of Scotch-Irish descent and an educator in London's avant-garde, but she followed him to Calcutta, and she was already a mature woman. It wasn't like she was going, with fancies in her head. While there, she connected and collaborated with other global intellectuals, Tagore, the Japanese art historian, and the Pan-Asianist Okakura Kakutsu, and of course, J.C. Bose. And the last 3 chapters of my book are about her, precisely because you can't understand the legacy of Vivekananda unless you understand her, because she is the one who spreads it again in a new way. He christened her the dedicated one, and she took on the task both of articulating his world's significance and embedding aspects of his theology into a nascent Indian nationalism. Indeed, there's sufficient evidence to suggest that she pushed for the Indian national idea much more than Vivekananda. Often, especially while in the West, he argued virulently against nationalism and what he saw as the ethos of the survival of the fittest, as I spoke about earlier. And when she first came to India and said to him that she was the most loyal Englishwoman that ever breathed in this country, he railed at her and called such patriotism a sin, implying that such love was an unworthy attachment. There is no doubt, however, that at other times he spoke of the sacred motherland, suggesting that he shared such a dangerous love of country. But of course, in this way, he spiritualized it. So he's trying to find a different means of speaking about it. She came to believe that he exemplified the national idea, but was not its spokesman or theoretician. This was a role that she sought for herself, perhaps with a little bit of arrogance. And as I was explaining at lunch, after he dies, she wants to step into his footsteps, and she begins to fantasize that she is a man and that she can do this. And it's very interesting that there are disciples or young men who come to her, and they're young Indian nationalists, and they don't take her advice, and she sends them away because she says, now I'm the guru. They should be listening to me. Although Vivekananda spoke often of man-making and the Kshatriya force, she elaborated these ideas into her own formulation in a pamphlet called Aggressive Hinduism in 1905 during Swadeshi. This was not his term. These were her words, and they were very important in a time of political effervescence that he would not see to live. And they were an important rubric against muscular Christianity. For Vivekananda, there's no doubt she was his besant in the making, and she was vital to reshaping his message when he re-embraced Kali worship openly in 1898 on a pilgrimage to Kir Bhawani and wrote a poem about the goddess. I don't know if you know this poem, but he discussed Kali's darkness, her power for destruction, her love of madness. When he returned from this journey, he withdrew and was no longer interested in, quote, doing good. He even told Nivedita that patriotism was a mistake. Now, I'll have more to say about why she was so fearful of this side of Vivekananda, the non-self, that he embraced at this crucial moment of his life story. For now, I'll suggest that this incomprehension was later transformed into a deep appreciation of Kali's power, as Nivedita became the goddess's Western spokeswoman. I think it's really important to understand that it was remarkable for these women who were Protestant, did not have the Virgin Mary, to encounter a vision of the divine feminine in this way, and also the divine feminine that was so powerful. And I think she liked actually acknowledging the aggression that Kali exemplified. She wrote her own book on Kali, though it seems that Vivekananda looked over the text. When there were suggestions that she rewrite certain passages, she refused unless he personally ordered her to do so as her guru, but he never did. And he was savvy in finding a forward-looking British woman of education to present Kali's case. After all, Kali worship horrified the Brahmos, and it seemed to expose the lower levels of Hindu worship. Kali herself was deemed to epitomize Hindu primitivism. This was widely discussed all over the West. She even spoke at Kali Ghat, where the goats, the kids, are sacrificed for prasad. And she stated that the great glory of this mother worship lies in its bestowal of manhood. For Aurobindo and Bipin Chandra Pal, her book recast Kali from being a symbol of national degeneration into an icon of national dynamism. They always regarded it as her greatest contribution. And now I want to revert to the question of whether there are two Vivekanandas. For some reason, this assertion that he was deceitful or saying two different people in two different places really disturbs me, and I want to explain why. At first glance, it appears that his message altered according to his audience. The superficial dissonances are hard to avoid. In the West, he emphasized universality, insisting that Christians recognize the world's diversities. In India, he was concerned apparently with the Gita and the biceps, a statement that in fact he made only once, even though it has become the rubric by which he is almost inevitably condemned or applauded today. And by the way, he gave it in a lecture where, right after a lecture, where he'd spoken about a puny sadhu who had faced down Alexander the Great. So you could be weak and strong, or you could be strong physically and strong. So it's very interesting. It's not, these things come out, and this is the same thing about the feminine and the masculine. Even if we set aside such stereotypes of Vivekananda, there's no doubt he does repeat the man-making message, especially to his monks and novices and in other Indian settings. So I say that in the end, he was more like the Buddha who spoke different truths to different publics. Ordinarily, people talk about the Buddha in relationship to Vivekananda in terms of metaphysical and spiritual connections. But in conversation with somebody I didn't know, a novelist named Kirthik Sasidaran, I began to think about the Buddha's impact in a different way. Vivekananda seemed to employ the Buddha's method of skillful speech to draw people away from extremes. Certainly in the West, he preached against materialism, violence, and fanaticism, his, quote, nationalism focusing on the tolerance of Indian society. He sought to introduce yoga to draw Westerners away from the values of muscular Christianity and from the hardness of their minds and bodies. And it's very interesting to hear him talk about how inflexible the Yankees are. And he talks about the women wearing chainmail when they go into the sea by talking about how their corsets. And he finds it remarkable that they could be so literally tight-laced. Against Western brutality, he hoped to teach mildness. Against the busyness of Western industry and punctuality, he asserted the primacy of meditation and timelessness, and explained that the processes of concentration were not ends but means. He didn't seek miraculous cure like Christian scientists, but advised instead perseverance in the search for transcendence. And to achieve his ends, he scolded, a habit which the Western women in particular found hard to bear. He was not sensitive to the gender dynamics of their interaction, but he also openly criticized what he saw as Western chivalry, as a form of, quote, sex that hampered women's strength. And there's one devotee named Sister Christine, and she tells the story about how he blew cigarette smoke in her face, and how horrified she was. And then she began to realize that he was giving her a lesson. He refused to help her down rocks. He said, they're teaching you how to be helpless. Do not be helpless. So he was trying to teach the same lessons of robustness among his female acolytes, but he didn't call it man-making. Indeed, the inability to find another word for what he was doing with the women is part of the deep-rootedness of the stereotypes that he engaged with. But besides the scolding, he also encouraged and above all listened. Despite his often socially conservative view of women and his conviction that marriage was a kind of austerity, he surprised them by his attentiveness to their spiritual and emotional needs. His often traditional statements about women did not preclude a vision of their spiritual importance or his interest in their religious and affective lives. So if this was his technique in the West, in India it was rather different. Here again, the vision of nationalism was in play, although in a very different fashion. He wanted to end what he saw as Indian timidity, to shift attitudes of subservience and fear, and above all, to resist imitation. Now, when young and traveling across the breadth and length of India, he took two books, the Gita and A Kempis's Imitation of Christ. The latter was a 15th century text that guided Christian aspirants to withdraw from the world in search of spiritual growth. He valued it as a manual of devotion equal to any within his own tradition, and extolled it precisely because it indicted contemporary British missionaries who didn't follow its lessons. But later, he became more ambivalent about imitation when it could not but conjure up colonial subjection. When, for example, he came to the World Parliament in 1893, he advocated universalism, but also insisted from the very beginning on self-respecting differentiation. The Christian is not to become a Hindu or a Buddhist, nor a Hindu or a Buddhist to become a Christian, but each must assimilate the spirit of the others and yet preserve his individuality and grow according to his own law of growth. And that's very important. The law of growth is part of his evolutionary arsenal. And this is what's key. He labored to understand how one changed while remaining oneself, an existential concern that he returned to throughout his life. Such issues, of course, were personal, but also profoundly cultural and political. How did a people or a nation alter itself or find new sources of strength without surrendering its values and identity? As early as 1894, he wondered if the Indian masses could become, quote, Occidental in energy, activism, and equality, while remaining, quote, Hindu in religion. By religion, he meant not just spiritual concerns, but also cultural values. How could India remain open to the world without losing itself in harmful Western ideas? How were Indians, both as individuals and as a nation, to realize themselves? In California in 1900, he proclaimed, "Religion is not an imitation of Jesus or Muhammad. Even if an imitation is good, it is never genuine. Be not an imitation of Jesus, but be Jesus. You are quite as great as Jesus, Buddha, or anybody else." The skillful speech he employed was part of the pulling and prodding his audiences to the middle, away from the extremes that hampered them. I've suggested that he taught meditation to urge Westerners away from busyness, distraction, and hardness. However, when he returned to India, he constrained the spiritual spontaneity of his guru brothers and novices with new routines and regulations. Nothing's more striking than the differences between how the monks acted right after Ramakrishna's death at Baranagar and how they increasingly acted at Belar Mat. He instituted in Belar Mat the Delsart method. Now, this is really funny. It's a method of breathing and expression that was important for actors and singers in the West. And it was pioneered by the French singing and acting coach, François Delsart. He had mocked this method in the West, advocating instead a control of the pranayama. He even joined these exercises to dumbbell training to deepen the monks' emotional and physical endurance in the cause of practical Vedanta. So he was actually trying to ask them to do the opposite of what they might have done in their own societies. This, of course, takes us to what in India is generally regarded as the core of his teaching, practical Vedanta, and a revised vision of karma yoga. Now, the word practical, of course, conjures up many of the cliches of American influence, and I would say, and that's another chapter in the book, that many of these things were not American influence. They used American words, but he was in dialogue both with Westerners as well as within his own Hindu tradition. But he was deeply concerned with the idea of dealing sensibly and realistically with real-world problems. And he was living through the emergence of American pragmatism, which became almost a secular religion in the United States. He deployed it in a way that fought against Western stereotypes of Indians as, quote, natural metaphysicians, and argued an argument the British had made to deprive Indians of higher education and science. Practical Vedanta, in my view, emerged hand in hand with don't touchism, his hatred of don't touchism. He hated the endless ceremonials, the food prohibitions, and bans against caste intermarriage and dining. He concluded, quote, "Those whose heads have a tendency to be troubled day and night over such questions simply deserve the name of wretches." And then he argued against, quote, "the fictitious differentiation between religion and the life of the world," and, as you know, reshaped the process of Advaita Vedanta. For Vivekananda, Advaita proposed a unity among all human beings, a worship of the divine within and of the other, a vision of universality that especially seduced his Western hearers. Even today, his vision of Advaita Vedanta may offend the orthodox, while some might perceive his practical Vedanta as a betrayal, and I'm using again these words of, in inverted commas, of Ramakrishna, who had warned against the worldly desire for name and fame that lurked behind philanthropy's apparent altruism. There are some wonderful memoirs of his guru brothers who were in the field helping the famine-stricken in 1897, 98, 99, 1900, who also remained distressed at the handling of money and reporting on their activities for publication. But Vivekananda persisted, and their lives became a model for his new kind of service, and he constantly complimented them. Remember, he gave his famous lectures in London on practical Vedanta before his return to India in 1897, in the midst of the horrible hunger that killed 12 million Indians. The famine shook him to the core. There was something about the famine, much worse than the plague, that really shook him to the core. Certainly, his vision of Advaita Vedanta also helped him envisage the nation. During his return tour in 1897, he spoke about Indian diversity and how unity, indeed unities, could only be achieved by celebrating the mosaic of cultures and religions that comprised what he called the sacred motherland. So-called racial mixing never frightened him, nor did he ever suggest segregation. For example, he called the Tamilians and the Aryans, for him, these were mere philological categories. They were not racial categories. He prioritized Advaita for metaphysical reasons, but also because he disliked the consequences of excessive symbolism and divisive ritual. Vivekananda proclaimed, and he was talking both to Indians and to his Protestant followers, when he said, "One sect has one particular form of ritual and thinks that is holy, while the rituals of another are simply arrant superstition." Advaita, by emphasizing formlessness, asserted that unity existed above the particularity. He felt this was imperative in India precisely because of its diversity. And he said, again, on his return trip, "Here have been the Aryan, the Dravidian, the Tatar, the Turk, the Mughal, the European, all the nations of the world pouring their blood into this land." When he spoke in this manner, he recognized that language, race, or ethnicity simply could not bring Indians together. Instead, he emphasized an admittedly Hindu vision of Advaitic unity that encouraged all creeds and spiritual inclinations to find shelter under its capacious umbrella. This is what I think he meant when he extolled our sacred religion, our religion, as one common ground. He saw fraternity as central to his vision of Indian unity and equality in defending the motherland. And I think what was honest about him was that he acknowledged when in India, in letters, the enmity between Hindu and Muslim brothers, but he also believed that fraternity would and should outweigh rivalry and antipathy. Of course, this vision of Advaita, again, prioritized the Hindu idea, a notion of embrace and connection that non-Hindus, and especially Muslims, might resist. So the question, of course, for us is when then did, quote, tolerance become an uneasy and undesired encompassment? And that, I think he was aware of this problem, and that's why he didn't like the word tolerance. Karma Yoga was for him an explicit program of national rejuvenation that sought a course between reformist meliorism and reactionary revivalism. He also was very, very keen on not depending on the state. So this notion of activism was key, because if you depended on the state, you would once again become dependent. He also focused on a compassionate and disinterested radical activism. And I'm almost done because I want to explain the radicalism. I've talked so much about the middle ground. Now I want to just briefly bring out the radicalism. He wanted the renouncer to retain the otherworldly subjectivity of yore, but now to tackle India's contemporary problems. He wanted the sannyasin to clear the deck of domesticity, as he had always done, and believed that actually he was more able to join in life's endless flux while retaining inner stillness. Somehow the transcendent and the mundane were no longer meant to oppose each other. But this vision was also encouraged amongst householders. But I would argue and end by the suggestion of militancy in this proposal. When after his pilgrimage to Kirbawani, he wanted nothing more than to sit in the lap of Kali, Nivedita was appalled. Vivekananda's need to experience the non-self, the baby self, by becoming one with the mother, even frightened her. They called the doctor. It's really fascinating. The Western women called the doctor. But for him, it was an opportunity to reject the hyperactivity that had been his fate as America's cyclonic monk. This momentary relinquishing of power and plans was integral to finding the detachment necessary for him to re-enter the fray. By returning to babyhood, he reclaimed unworldliness before re-engaging. Periodically, he would show this radical dimension even to his New England friends. When visiting the dungeon cages of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy, I don't know how many of you have been to this, but it's an extraordinary place. You can see the type comes in, and it's basically a monastery and a prison that is completely cut off from the rest of the world, okay? And when he went there with them, he muttered under his breath, "What a wonderful place to meditate." These prison cells have been designed for political prisoners who oppose Bourbon absolutism, and he had not missed the parallels with British oppression. He advocated the marshaling of so-called vital energy against tyranny and revealed how the deepest renunciation could also encompass the highest activism. This was the paradox that he elaborated in Karma Yoga. When Aurobindo was awaiting trial in 1908 in prison, he saw Vivekananda in a vision and urged his comrades to follow this yogic form of revolutionary asceticism. It was a kind of lila, divine play. They became Krishna in the prison house that entailed self-control, moral strength, and physical prowess to counter British hegemony over feeble Indians. While Vivekananda used skillful speech in the middle way to bring his hearers away from extremes, there remained this militant edge vital to his vision. Now, I would say that this militancy kept on coming into his thought and was very appealing, hence the biceps in the Gita, where people think about it. But it also explains why it drew people to socialism on the left, and today also inspires the more radical on the right. For these reasons, Vivekananda is a movable feast, intensely provocative, undoubtedly significant, but infinitely multifaceted. His life is one of preparation, since he died at 39. We do not even know what he would have made of Swadeshi. We are condemned to unknowability about what his future course might have been. Thank you very much. I'd love to take questions if there are any. Ah,
Yeah,
nice to sit. No, it's always good to sit. There's a question. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Would you like to go ahead? Go ahead. Can you speak up a little?
We need a mic there, I think.
good talk. It was really inspirational.
Oh, thank you.
And I really, having been in the US and been in churches which are like the Methodist, or I have interacted with the priests or pastors in America and in the universities of America. Some of the things that fascinated me, and I've actually been to Maine, New England, but I've never been here in Normandy. So when you speak about formlessness, then the thing about male-female ego that doesn't work, right?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last thing. After formlessness.
Formlessness. So then the gender, male, female, and it's the fluidity of it. So then that doesn't work. Like, so if it is formless, it is formless. However, so that's a thing which I was thinking. So when you mentioned something is a woman amongst women, so it's almost again the same thing. It's formless, so it doesn't matter which But he was obviously speaking with women, so he had to be a part of them in order to appeal and help them be in the same frequency as maybe he was. Another thing, I don't know much about Sister Nivedita, as much as probably I have heard about Vivekananda. I'm not sure what was her view of like being a British person. What was her view of, let's say, Sarada or Ramakrishna or Vivekananda? And then how did she integrate it with her worldview from where she comes? And that's something I would want to understand. I've seen many women who are Christian women, and they are really brilliant, very nice people, but they have in the past, and they work more for folks, and they actually feel the problem of other people, which is exactly what is prescribed in most religions, right? But when it comes to dogmatism, when it comes to identity, like who am I, and when the worldview gets impacted by that. So I mean, I have a very close friend in Texas, but when Donald Trump came to power, our friendship was strained. It was not because I don't like her or she doesn't like me, but I couldn't take that, she's supporting somebody whose worldview is in so much conflict with, my worldview, and in how, so whatever happened then is very relevant today.
Well, I think it's a great question about her, because there is no doubt, and the first chapter of the discussion of her talks about how he breaks down her identity, And at moments, it almost seems like a cruel process. At one stage, they're on the pilgrimage in the Himalayas, and she just falls weeping into the arms of her friends. There's two other women with her from the West, two other American women. And they actually say to Vivekananda, you're being too hard on her. And he goes slower, he listens to her, but he also, it seems, for a time, puts her in purdah, because it's very tricky. What is this white woman doing, living on her own, and she agrees for a time. It's only for a short period, I think. But what's so interesting is that her identity shifts in a profound way during the plague and in Calcutta. And she sees things, harrowing scenes. She works with another one of his disciples, Sadananda, and it never hits the three streets around. And at that moment, she loses her British identity. The treatment of the Indians during the plague, the forced quarantining, the lack of modesty accorded to Hindu women, the coercion of the gospel of sanitation, so, in inverted commas, that does it for her. And after that, she feels she's an Indian. However, she's not an Indian. And so the description of her inner life, which I try to, is one at times of bewilderment, and at times of fulfillment, and at times of deep confusion. She continues to pray as a Christian. When she goes back to America, she is in a church and she looks at the Virgin, but what appears before is Sharada. So wherever she is, she's going back and forth. And in many ways, she is, I think, less spiritually strong than Vivekananda. He can hold these two worlds together. It's very hard for her. And that's why I think she goes through a crisis after he dies and wants to step into his shoes and realizes she can't, but it takes her some time. Now, as for her relationship to Sharada, that's fascinating. She's quite an intellectual snob. So Sharada, of course, is illiterate. And at first she says, there's nothing that she can't do practically, but, her vision of the world is so small. And then she begins to realize that Sharada is something that she's never encountered. And she too becomes a disciple, pretty much. And she consults her all the time. And she becomes the patron of her school. In the end, Nivedita is not so keen on the school. It's somebody else who takes it over. What Nivedita really wanted to do was internationalize Vedanta, and that's what she tries to do by being in touch with all these global intellectuals. At the same time, when she does it, like when she always wonders if Vivekananda would have approved. So it's hard for her to retain her own judgment. But she still prays, she still celebrates Christmas, she takes out a manger, and this is very important to realize that he said to her, at first he says, I want you to become the ideal Hindu woman. It's the only time I've seen him really try to convert someone. And then he steps back because he doesn't, the coercion, you don't do that as a guru. You cannot coerce somebody. That's what he says.
So how would Vivekananda, even in present day Indian society also,
Could we take other questions?
I will talk to you later because
Yeah.
No problem. It would be
you.
great. If there is other questions, that's great.
Yeah.
I could talk to you forever. Yeah.
Carry on. Yeah.
I have a few questions. So first, about a comment that you said that, in US they didn't know many Indians. What I know that I think the Brahmos were invited and also the Buddhists are invited, and some Sri Lankan person went for this Buddhist thing.
They knew Mohini Chatterjee as well. They were actually taught by Mohini Chatterjee.
Right. So my question was how was the impact of Brahmos vis-a-vis Vivekananda? Because he also had Brahmo connections from his earlier self. So I don't know because they were seeing both these Indians for the first time, or if you call Sri Lanka as sort of South Asian, then also that person.
Can I answer one at a time? Because I don't have my pen to jot it down.
Right, sure.
Yeah, go ahead. The Brahmos, of course, are central to everything because, of course, he's a Brahmo. You'll see in the first chapter of the book, I go through this Brahmo background. And of course, the big question is, he could have become a Brahmo attorney like his father, an attorney, a householder. Why does he change? Why does he change? And the fact is, some people have argued, but I don't agree with them, that Brahmoist strand has just been repackaged, and that's into reformism. I think that truly underestimates the impact of Ramakrishna and what it meant to him to see God. One of the things that was so important about the encounter with Ramakrishna, he always said, my guru accomplished everything through an idol. And that was the thing that the Brahmos prohibited, right? So it was that, but also, as I try to explain in the book, it was the transformation that was brought by the love of Ramakrishna. This was not the austere piety of the Brahmos. This was ecstatic, tantric at times.
Leela.
Leela, ultimate Leela. And we misunderstand how important this remained for Vivekananda. He always said that he looked like a jnani, but he was underneath a bhakta. And it was the opposite with Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna was the true jnani, but he kept on saying that he acted as a bhakta. So I think these things are very important to understand that. He also wanted to see the divine.
No, my question was from the impact in US itself, because there was a
the
speaker
impact of the US,
from the
okay.
Brahmos,
Yeah.
and he had his Brahmo background, and he was, they're sort of uninvited, and of course there has been, I mean, all
Yeah.
of them gave talks, right? So what was the...
Yeah, there were Brahmos, but by the time of the parliament, he doesn't come as a Brahmo. Remember, he comes uninvited. He has no Samaj links. And Mazumdar is there, who's the great Brahmo. And Mazumdar, very shortly afterward, runs a campaign against him.
Oh.
Yeah. And that's what happens in America. And of course, Mazumdar has already written a book called The Oriental Christ. So they do have this, and they have through the Unitarians, they know about Ram Mohan Roy, but he really does everything he can to place himself outside of that. And he even supports a Brahmin. He's not opposed to intercaste dining, but he even supports a Brahmin who says, you mustn't make us eat with lower castes, it's disgusting. And instead of shouting at that guy, he says, I understand why he feels that way. This is fascinating.
This is Vivekananda.
Yeah?
Oh, okay.
It's in the book. He's got another question.
Just one final thing.
Okay,
Sure.
yeah.
Okay, I have a really quick question. So on the Hindu-Muslim,
Sorry.
on the Hindu-Muslim question,
Yeah.
Vivekananda said also that, in my mind's eye, I see that India would come out of this strife and chaos by using the Vedanta soul and Muslim body. So I just wanted to understand that, what according to him was that future, and also what would be his message to the India and the contemporary. So yeah.
His message to what? Indian what?
Today,
India today.
to the fellow Indians.
I've said I wouldn't talk about this, but I really think that the emphasis on universalism was key to him, and diversity. And so I find a lot of the way he's used today surprising, very surprising. And that famous letter he writes about the Hindu mind and the Muslim body, I mean, even that's a little bit tricky because it's a hierarchy. The mind somehow, right? And then there's the body. But it's actually, I think I didn't get that before I wrote the book. I think it's more complicated than that. There is an admiration for the Muslim body, the warrior Muslim, the warrior. And in the same way that there was for, that he admired that strength. That was why he was trying to get people to do dumbbell exercises. And one of his monks, Latu, ultimately left. He didn't like the bells. He refused to do the dumbbell exercises. He thought that that Ramakrishna was being betrayed.
Also, Latu was an outcast.
He was also an outcast. And it's a fantastic story.
Story,
Yeah. It's a very interesting story. And he's a very...
He was a sweeper, actually. He used to sweep the Dakshineswar temple and was
and
converted
serve
by
Sharada.
Yeah, Sharada.
And it's his whole story. I wish we could really find out more about him. To me, they used to call him Plato.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much for very illustrating lecture on Vivekananda. And I was very impressed when Chancellor Sir introduced that you broke the male bastion by going into the Oxford University. Don't you think that spirit helped you to write down on Vivekananda, that Vivekananda's spirit was there in you right from the day one?
Absolutely. Can you hear me? I was explaining at lunch that I came to this as a European historian. I was reading Romain Rolland, and Rolland had a fantasy that he was going to bring Gandhi, and Gandhi would stop the European fascism. This is, again, the spiritual and the oriental would save Western civilization from its inherent brutality. And in the midst of that, he wrote the book on Gandhi, he met Gandhi, but he also wrote books on Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. And it was in the book on Vivekananda that this arrogant French intellectual had his first encounter with William James. He had his encounter with Vivekananda and with aspects, and above all, the oceanic sensation. That was from Ramakrishna. And it was when I saw that I realized it was bringing my worlds together. And in Oxford, of course, we have so many South Asians of quality. And I would go to these seminars on the Gita, and I would say to myself, but none of us know anything about this. And I began to look at them and how they knew Marx and Darwin and Freud and all their own stuff, and we knew nothing of them. And I, of course, understood it was a legacy of colonialism, blah, blah, blah. But it was that I wanted to overturn. When I was at Jaipur, somebody asked me what right I had to speak about this, right? And I thought about it afterward, and I thought, well, it's Vivekananda's fault. He came to America. You know, he changed us. And that, in a sense, is the argument of the book. How he changed it was very unusual, particular to America. Some people say he homogenized Hinduism through Advaita. He took away all the particularities. He elevated formlessness, blah, blah, blah. Other people would say this was essential to the Indian freedom struggle. It enabled people to stop thinking about religious quarrels. You know, it depends how you look at him. But nothing of substance is going to have, everything of substance is going to have shadow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating lecture. Would you like to expand on a very fascinating point you made about Buddha and Vivekananda?
Who in Bull?
Buddha. Gautam
yeah,
Buddha.
yeah.
You said, if I'm correct, that there's a drawing away from extremes, and that's a commonality. And is there, would you like to elaborate on that? It's a very, very, very insightful observation.
Well, actually, this is something, it's in the book, but it's not a main theme, but it should become a main theme. Because imagine me trying to work through the Indological material where they talk about Vivekananda and the Buddha and this and that, or the stuff on Karma Yoga where they keep on insisting that Vivekananda got everything from the West, which is not true, just not true. And it suddenly hit me that it's in the method of his being a guru that the Buddha is important. And this was in a conversation with this man. And I could go through some of the most remarkable examples. I have never had a guru. I'm not a devotee, but anyone who has told me of the guru making them do things that were completely outside their ken. It would make them so uncomfortable. It was precisely that discomfort that they preached, that they sought in the acolyte. It's very interesting that the scolding, that was really interesting because the women could never get used to the scolding. And then he would explain, you're like my family, so who else can I scold? But of course, these were notions of attachment and domestic intimacy that these American women couldn't understand. They're all Protestants, where you never said, you never shouted. So what's really interesting is if you read Yogananda's autobiography, he discusses at length how the ego is weak in America, and you mustn't scold them. And it's interesting because the first few chapters, the template is Vivekananda. Yeah, and they're all the same Bengalis, and he goes and he visits M, the one who wrote, So there's already a legacy and a tradition being built for the worldwide travel.
So I'll use my discretion and ask the last question.
Yeah.
So, you spoke about Nivedita's shock at Vivekananda suddenly saying, I want to be the baby on the mother's lap. And you say he's reverting to his babyhood. What if I were to provoke you and say that he's actually reverting to what his master was so far Kali was concerned? This is exactly what Ramakrishna did. He sat on the lap of the deity.
You see, in the book, what I say is that the pilgrimage enables him to reconnect to Ramakrishna and the teachings. And of course, the whole thing about Ramakrishna is Ramakrishna inverts everything. For somebody who's new to Ramakrishna, it's wild. He instead of being the guru, he's the baby. So and Vivekananda keeps on saying, I didn't know what to do with this brain sick baby. And of course, the reason babyhood is so important for Ramakrishna is babyhood is a state of universal. It's a universal state before language, culture, sect, class, caste. So to be a baby is to be one's authentic self, you know, the essential self. So these are the kinds of discussions, and of course they wanted Vivekananda to be the manly man. And he's rejecting that and moving into a realm of spontaneity and before moral categories are created. And that's why Ramakrishna is so difficult to understand, but at the same time so enlightening because he talks endlessly about babyhood. I mean, he used to hide his sweets from his disciples. He didn't want to share.
So also, you know, your last point that Vivekananda's life was one of preparation.
Yeah.
What struck me immediately was the contrast that Ramakrishna once said through a dream that he had, that his own life was a preparation for the bringing of Noren into this world. He said, that's what Ramakrishna said, that's why I have been born, that I had to prepare the world for Noren's arrival. He never called him Vivekananda, he always called him Noren.
But that's the dream about the Rishi. And
That's the Swadeshi dream. Yes.
But that's, I'm sorry to be an historian, but you are one too. It's Saradananda when it's already post.
Yeah, post.
And they're creating the legacies, and they're rearranging the hierarchies, even more than Vivekananda did. Yeah. And of course, Vivekananda would never have agreed with that.
Yeah, I'm sure he would.
He'd never have agreed with that, yeah.
So Ruth, thank you so much.
It's been great.
This has been great, absolutely great. Thank you so much. And come back to Ashoka soon.
I hope so. I hope that everything goes well and the university becomes the most famous in the world.